It's my pleasure to introduce Jens Kruse. Many of you know Jens is a front desk volunteer at the Orcas Library, neighbor, and probably from a lot of different other venues on the island. But it does turn out that his expertise goes beyond checking books in and out. Originally from Hamburg, Germany, Jens was educated in German and American universities. He has recently retired from a 33-year career at Wellesley College of teaching German language and literature in its cultural, historical, and political context. He has published books and articles on Goethe, Kafka, and other authors. Most recently, he has prepared for e-notated classics, annotated electronic editions of Kafka's stories such as The Metamorphosis, The Hunger Artist, In the Penal Colony, and A Country Doctor. Today, Jens will speak to us about the question, does the late stage of the Weimar Republic in Germany hold lessons for the current moment of the American Republic? After Jens's presentation, we'll walk around with the microphone and you go ahead and ask questions. I did run out of handouts, so if anybody didn't get one and would like some suggested reading materials and web links, I will have a stack of them at the library tomorrow. Okay, so thank you very much. And Jens.
Are we okay, Phil?
We're okay.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Orcas Island Library and, again, Kathy Lundy for sponsoring and organizing my presentation. The title of my presentation is, as Kathy just said, it's not a very concise or catchy title. It is a question, and it goes on for a bit. Does the late stage of the Weimar Republic in Germany hold lessons for the current moment in the American Republic? And before I get into the main task of that talk, namely to try to answer that question, I need to get three necessary preliminaries out of the way. First, a caveat. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Mark Twain is reputed to have said that, but almost certainly didn't. Whoever said this, the point made is that historical analogies are often discernible, but they are also imperfect. This, however, does not mean that we cannot learn from apparent historical similarities as long as we keep in mind that dictum and acknowledge differences as well as similarities, as any good comparison should. Second, Godwin's Law. Godwin's Law, promulgated by an American attorney and author named Mike Godwin in 1990, is an internet adage that asserts that if an online discussion, regardless of topic or scope, goes on long enough, sooner or later, someone will compare someone or something to Hitler. During the recent election campaign, comparisons of Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, not just on the web, but also in other media, were frequent enough to prompt Trump's daughter Ivanka at some point to almost plaintively assert, "My father is not Hitler." While such comparisons may in some instances have been understandable, they were for the most part unfortunate, not just because they were often wrong, but also because they are dangerous, because they tend to diminish the uniqueness of Hitler's historical crimes and of his evil. So it is a good thing that my task here is not to compare Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, but to compare the late years of the Weimar Republic to the current historical moment in the US. But it will be difficult to do that without referring to Hitler more than once, so it is useful to get this distinction established. Third and final preliminary. Some professional and personal context. I am not a historian, not a political scientist. I am a recently retired professor of German language and literature. As such, I am a literary historian and long-term student and teacher of German literature, culture, politics, and history. As an aside, most of that professional life, 33 years, I worked at Wellesley College. Yes, Wellesley College, the alma mater of Hillary Rodham Clinton. Maybe just as relevantly, I was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1949. So I grew up playing cowboys and Indians with my cousins in the rubble fields of my native city. I had a youth and an upbringing that was a daily reminder of the catastrophic consequences that emanated from the destruction of the Weimar democracy and the rise of Hitler's dictatorship, of the catastrophic outcomes of the 12 years of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. With these preliminaries out of the way, let me now try to answer the question of my title. Does the late stage of the Weimar Republic in Germany hold lessons for the current moment of the American Republic? To approach and answer that question, I will, in condensed form, try to delineate the factors and steps that led to the destruction of the Weimar Republic, to the legitimate ascension of Hitler to the chancellorship of that republic, and the transformation of that rule into a dictatorship. In doing so, I will focus on the years 1932 and 1933. Ideally, such an analysis would yield a sort of checklist that we could then use to observe what has happened to the American Republic during the primary and general election campaigns, during the presidential transition between November 8 and January 20, and since Trump has assumed office. So here we will focus mostly on the years 2016 and 2017. The Weimar Republic, the first fully democratic German state, lasted, depending on where one fixes its endpoint, only 15 years or so. It is pretty clear where to fix the beginning. Toward the end of World War I, as it became clear that Germany would lose the war, a mutiny of sailors in Kiel sparked the revolution, and on November 9, 1918, Emperor Wilhelm II abdicated, and Philipp Scheidemann, a social democratic politician, proclaimed a German republic. Its precise endpoint is a little harder to fix, but it's often identified as March 24, 1933, when the Reichstag, in a vote that was unanimous, except for the votes of the members of the Social Democratic Party, passed an enabling act, the Ermächtigungsgesetz, giving Hitler full dictatorial powers. The young republic struggled with tremendous difficulties throughout its short life. Near civil warlike conditions during its first years in the aftermath of the Lost War, economic and political crises caused, at least in part, by the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty, hyperinflation, and large segments of the population and society that saw the young republic as illegitimate and yearned for a return to a monarchy or other form of autocratic state. The Weimar Republic saw some economic and political stabilization in the mid-20s and late 20s, accompanied by a remarkable cultural flowering. But the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent world economic crisis had catastrophic economic and political consequences in Germany. From here on, I will present the events leading to the end of the Weimar Republic and Hitler's dictatorship in the form of a chronology, because we will want to have specific events and steps before us as we then consider the question of my title. 1932. July 31 elections. The Nazis double their strength and become the largest party in the Reichstag with 37.4% of the vote and 227 seats. In the November 6th elections of that year, the Nazis lose 35 seats. Their percentage falls to 33.1%. 1933, January 30, Hitler is appointed Reich Chancellor by President Hindenburg, with von Papen as Vice Chancellor. It is important to note here that Hitler became the Chancellor of a coalition government with smaller traditional right-wing nationalist parties. His was a presidential cabinet. It did not have a parliamentary majority. Of the 13 cabinet positions, only 2, in addition to Hitler as Chancellor, were occupied by Nazis. The traditionalist politicians like Vice Chancellor von Papen thought they had, quote, hired Hitler, that they could and would control him. February 1, in his appeal to the German people, Hitler strikes traditional nationalist themes. He speaks of, quote, the restoration of the unity and spirit and will of our folk, unquote. He pledges, quote, merciless war against spiritual, political, and cultural nihilism, unquote, and sends a message of anti-communism. On the same day, at his request, Hindenburg dissolves Parliament and calls for a new election on March 5. February 3, Hitler meets with the leadership of the armed forces and assures them that he wants to eradicate pacifism, Marxism, and democracy in Germany. He also assures them that he will reintroduce universal military service and will greatly increase the military budget. The officers respond enthusiastically and pledge their support. February 4, emergency decree for the protection of the German people. This decree, promulgated ostensibly because the communists threatened a general strike, which by the way never materialized, was used to censor the communist and social democratic press and harass left-wing candidates. Other newspapers practiced self-censorship. February 6, Hitler's government introduces press censorship. February 22nd, use of the SA and SS, the Nazi paramilitary organizations, as auxiliary police in Prussia, the largest German state. Beginning repression of leftist parties, the Social Democrats and the Communists. February 27, and this is a very important date, a fire destroys the Reichstag. February 28, Hitler-led government suspends basic civil liberties with a decree for the protection of the people and the state. March 3rd, the Communist Party leadership is arrested. March 5 elections, Nazis, after anti-communist and anti-social democratic terror in the streets, win 43.9% of the Reichstag vote. Enough only for a simple majority with nationalist parties, but not enough to change the constitution. The Communist Party is banned. March 13, the establishment of the Reichsministry of Folk Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. March 20, Nazis opened the first official concentration camp in Dachau, near Munich. March 22nd, establishment of the Department of, quote, racial hygiene in the Interior Ministry. March 24, the Reichstag passes the Enabling Act, giving Hitler full dictatorial powers. All remaining parties in the Reichstag, except the Social Democrats, vote in favor. March 31, first law of Gleichschaltung, synchronization of the states. The states were brought under central authority by various methods: laws, intimidation, cooptation, bureaucratic purges, and subversions. April 7, removal of Jews, communists, social democrats, and liberal political opponents from the civil service. April 25, law against the overcrowding of German schools and universities, limits number of Jewish students in German schools to 1.5%. This leads to a purge of Jews and opposition intellectuals from university positions. In the next weeks and months, other institutions and professions, medical, journalistic, publishing, cultural, and to some extent judicial, are similarly purged by methods that include and usually combine new laws, intimidation, co-optation, self-purging, etc. May 2nd, police and SA deputies raid the headquarters of free unions. The dissolution of labor unions follows and the formation of the Nazi German Labor Front. May 10, public burning of, quote, un-German books in Berlin and other university cities. June, remaining political parties are either banned or dissolve themselves. July 14th, the Nazis become the only legal party in Germany. November 12th, the Nazi Reichstag is elected without opposition. November 30, establishment of the Gestapo. December 1, law for the unity of party and state. With these actions, the Nazis essentially completed the transformation of the Weimar Republic into a one-party state and dictatorship. But there are two more actions in 1934 that should be mentioned and that consolidated Hitler's power even further. On June 30, in the so-called Night of the Long Knives, Hitler purged and disempowered dissident elements in his own movement, mainly in the SA. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, and 120 others were killed by forces of the SS. While the killing went on, Hitler also took the opportunity to kill some of the traditional nationalist politicians who had thought that they could control him, that they had hired him. On August 2nd, President Hindenburg died, and Hitler amalgamated the offices of President and Chancellor, consolidating his position as sole Führer. The conflation of Nazi power and German power is now so complete that the swastika becomes the official German flag. At this point, let me recapitulate and present to you in summary form the specific events and steps that Hitler used to transform his legitimate ascension to the office of Chancellor into his absolute dictatorship. They are the claim to restore German greatness, cozying up to the military, suppression of political opposition, press censorship, the deputization of the military wings of his and other nationalist parties as auxiliaries of the police, exploitation of an emergency and terrorist event, arrest of the leadership of opposition parties, establishment of propaganda as a tool of government, institution of openly racist policies and institutions, passage of an enabling law conferring dictatorial powers, purging of opponents and dissent, use of instruments of state power against unions and political parties, book burnings, establishment of a one-party state, establishment of a secret police, purge of opponents or competitors in his own party. Let me now take these steps and actions one by one and see whether we have observed similar steps or events in our republic in 2016 and 2017 so far. The claim to restore German greatness. Donald Trump started his campaign with the slogan, "Make America Great Again," and placed that goal into the context of harsh measures against the other, from illegal immigrants to Muslims. The gambit is remarkably similar to Hitler's rhetoric. We will have to see to what degree the rhetoric is implemented. By now, the Trump administration has issued 2 executive orders to ban most Muslim immigration in an attempt to implement this rhetoric. While they have been stopped by the courts for the moment, it remains to be seen whether the administration will prevail with these actions. There are reports that the administration is planning to hire, quote, thousands of new, quote, deportation agents. There even have been reports that the administration is considering deputizing the National Guard in certain states for that purpose. Recently, Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly issued 2 memos specifying a surge, his verb, in deportations by expanding categories of individuals that are deportable and by beefing up the quote, deportation force, both by hiring up to 10,000 new ICE agents and by deputizing state and local law enforcement officers. Cozying up to the military. President Trump has nominated an unusually high number of retired generals to cabinet and other important positions. He also has promised to increase the military budget and so generally to make our military stronger. So he is, in a sense, cozying up to the military. But the US military is a highly professional institution and not a political force, as the military in the Weimar Republic was. Indications that military officers would refuse illegal orders, such as orders to torture, to kill family members of terrorists, or to steal occupied countries' natural resources, suggests that the US military would resist unconstitutional and illegal orders and uses rather than enthusiastically embrace them, as the German military did. But it's also true that his administration is the first to have all three top security jobs, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, filled by senior military veterans at the same time, which is somewhat unnerving. Suppression of political opposition. The Trump campaign or the Republican Party have not raided opposition parties' offices, arrested or beat up their leaders. But Trump at one point invited the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's email and apparently benefited from Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee while ostensibly disbelieving that the Russians did it and refusing to denounce it. He certainly benefited from these electronic raids. But as far as we know, he has not yet ordered operations of this kind against opposition parties. Now that Director Comey has revealed that there is an ongoing FBI investigation into whether Trump and or his associates colluded with the Russian interference in our election, we will have to see whether he or his campaign did, in fact, actively invite or knowingly acquiesce in such operations. Press censorship. It seems highly unlikely that the Trump administration would be able to institute press censorship as Hitler's government was able to do by emergency decree in the Weimar Republic. But there are some troublesome signs. Trump's talk about tightening the libel laws, his vendettas against reporters and news organizations that write things about him he doesn't like, no matter how true, campaigns of hate and intimidation by some of Trump's followers against Jewish journalists, against critical journalists, etc. Further, since taking office, the Trump administration has tried to delegitimize established and respected news media by labeling them fake news. This campaign of delegitimation morphed into one of demonization when Trump labeled journalists as, quote, enemies of the people. In 1932 and 1933, the Nazis used the term Lügenpresse, lying press, as a way to attack and delegitimize the press. Fake news is the modern equivalent of this term, and the term Lügenpresse has been chanted, in German no less, by Trump supporters. Even more worryingly, enemies of the people smacks of the Nazi term Volksfeinde, which was used against Jews, communists, social democrats, and generally anyone perceived as oppositional. Volksfeinde usually ended up in concentration camps. Meanwhile, Fox News appears to be the almost exclusive source of news for Trump voters and has morphed into something akin to an official Trump channel. About a month ago, and I'm quoting from the Washington Post, quote, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer banned reporters from CNN, the New York Times, Politico, the Los Angeles Times, and BuzzFeed from attending a gaggle, a non-televised briefing, but gave access to a number of other reporters, including those representing conservative outlets. This is not yet press censorship, but it is unprecedented, and it is a step in that direction. The deputization of the military wings of the Nazi and other nationalist parties as auxiliaries of the police. Nothing even remotely similar to Hitler's use of the SA, the Nazi brown shirts, as a part of the police force has happened in the US in 2016 and 17. For one, US political parties don't have paramilitary wings. There was condoning and even incitement of violence at many Trump rallies. There was menacing talk about by the candidate, about what, quote, Second Amendment people could do to his opponent. But Donald Trump is far away from having at his beck and call a well-organized force of 450,000 in 1933 to 3 million in 1934, armed and fanatical thugs, as the Nazis did. Exploitation of an emergency and terrorist event. If a terrorist event of the magnitude of 9/11 occurs during Donald Trump's term, or if there is a prolonged series of small to medium-sized terrorist events, his administration might well be tempted to institute measures far harsher than the provisions of the Patriot Act after 9/11. But even a Republican Congress and a conservative Supreme Court would probably not be willing to give the executive branch the kind of sweeping powers to suspend civil liberties and due process of law that the emergency decrees of the Weimar Republic in the wake of the Reichstag fire gave the Hitler government. But if an event comparable to the Reichstag fire should happen anytime soon, it would certainly constitute a moment of extreme peril for our republic, not just because of the event itself, but also because the administration's possible reaction to it. The President's advisor, Stephen Miller, recently asserted the following, and it deserves to be quoted in full. Quote, "The end result of this, though, is that our opponents, the media, and the whole world will soon see, as we begin to take further actions, that the powers of the President to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned." Unquote. This authoritarian threat should send shivers down our spines. Arrest of the leadership of opposition parties. It is hard to conceive that a Trump administration would be given or try to seize the power necessary to enable them to conduct the kind of wholesale arrest, torture, imprisonment, and protective custody in what eventually became concentration camps, and finally, in many cases, killing of political opponents that the Nazi government engaged in. Yes, Donald Trump labeled Hillary Clinton a crook and led his adoring followers in chants of "lock her up." But that apparently is not going to happen, and even if it did, it would still be very far from the kind of judicial, police, and SA terror that the Nazis unleashed against their opponents. Having said that, it is troubling enough that a political candidate would even suggest the possibility that he would use the power of the state to incarcerate a political opponent. Establishment of propaganda as a tool of government. Hitler's appointment of Joseph Goebbels as Minister für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda signaled the crucial role that complete control of the media and brilliant exploitation of relatively new technologies like radio and film would play for the Nazi rule. It is hard to see how the Trump administration could gain similar control of the media or the message. But Trump's appointment of Steve Bannon of the far-right Breitbart News, aka propaganda site, as his chief strategist and senior counselor cannot in any way be seen as a good sign. The repeated use of lies and falsehoods during the early days of the Trump administration, the defense of the use of, quote, alternate facts, suggests the new administration will use at least some of the tools of propaganda. During the President's address to Congress on February 28, he said the following, quote, "I have ordered the Department of Homeland Security to create an office to serve American victims. The office is called VOICE, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. We are providing a voice to those who have been ignored by our media and silenced by special interests. When we examine the provenance and purpose and possible purpose of such an office, the result should be alarming. Under Steve Bannon's leadership, Breitbart inaugurated a section on the website called Black Crime. Also, the Nazi regime constructed an elaborate bureaucratic mechanism to catalog alleged Jewish crimes against innocent Aryan citizens. It is hard to avoid the suspicion that such an office would use dubious data to disseminate divisive propaganda about alleged immigrant criminality. But propaganda in this day and age will not always share similarities with Goebbels' propaganda tools and methods. The modern internet technologies and artificial intelligence in our moment make possible the manipulation of information both at mass and at individual level in ways that were unimaginable to the Nazis. Institution of openly racist policies and institutions. The establishment of a Department of Racial Hygiene in some US government department has not been proposed. The Nuremberg laws, presumably, are not around the corner. But Donald Trump's racist rhetoric and the racist convictions of some of his supporters make it legitimate to fear that such views could make their way into policy in more subtle and subterranean ways. The confirmation of a man with the past of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General makes one wonder to what extent he will allow the Justice Department to enforce civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. Recent revelations about Sebastian Gorka, Trump's top counterterrorism advisor, indicate that he swore a lifetime oath to a far-right Hungarian group, the VTG Rand. The State Department classifies the VTG Rand as having been, quote, under the direction of the Nazi government of Germany during World War II. It is a racist and fascist organization that was resurrected in Hungary after the fall of communism. Meanwhile, Steve Bannon, who refashioned the Breitbart news site into a racist, white supremacist, anti-Semitic propaganda platform, is Trump's chief strategist and senior advisor. To contemplate the full import of that title is not reassuring. This is an area where extreme vigilance seems justified. Passage of an enabling law conferring dictatorial powers. As I said a moment ago, I cannot see, even in the context of a major terrorist event, the Republican Houses of Congress passing an enabling law of the suite obtained by Hitler from the Weimar Parliament. I say this for two reasons. First, the crisis of the Weimar Republic in 1933 was much more systemic and deep than even a 9/11 type crisis or the broader crisis of our current situation. Second, and I will talk more about this in a moment, there were significant political forces in the Weimar Republic other than the Nazis that wanted to abolish the parliamentary system, and therefore were quite willing to vote themselves out of existence. At least at this point, I cannot see even the most rabid anti-government parts of the Republican Party wanting to do the same. But given the current majorities in the House and Senate and the future character of the Supreme Court, there may be only very limited constraints on the Trump administration's power, even without an enabling act. Purging of opponents and dissent. I do not see the possibility of the Trump administration passing laws that explicitly enable it to purge certain groups of people or certain opinions from the ranks of the civil service. But that does not mean that a similar program could not be accomplished or attempted by more surreptitious ways. The recent resignation or firing of highly placed career foreign service officers in the State Department is not a good sign. Nor is White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer's recent reaction to the news that some career employees in the State Department were using the dissent memo process to register their objection to the Muslim ban. He said, quote, "These career bureaucrats have a problem with it. I think they should either get with the program or they can go," unquote. Since I wrote those last sentences, and that was about a month ago, the Trump administration has asked for the resignation of 46 US attorneys. This, I know, is not unusual as administrations change, but there are some worrisome details here. When Preet Bharara, the US attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan, who had previously been asked by Trump to stay on, refused to resign, he was fired. It has since emerged that he was overseeing an investigation into stock trades made by the President's Health Secretary, Tom Price. Also, the New York Times recently reported that the Federalist Society, an organization of conservatives and libertarians supported by billionaires like the Koch brothers and the Mercer family, is playing a critical role in reshaping the judiciary as Mr. Trump begins the process of filling what could be the most federal court vacancies left to any president in nearly half a century. In other words, the very branch of government that has so far been most effective in being a check on Trump's power might be more compliant in the near or medium future. Here too, vigilance seems to be in order. Use of instruments of state power against unions and political parties. It seems unlikely that the Trump administration would attempt to ban unions and political parties outright, as the Nazis did. But the nomination of Andrew Puzder for Department of Labor, a corporate leader who has made it clear that workers are an annoying nuisance, who should be paid as little as possible, was worrisome. He has since been forced to withdraw. The new nominee, Alex Acosta, at first blush has a more traditional resume. Among other things, he has served on the National Labor Relations Board. However, such experience may have prepared him well to sabotage the mission of the Department of Labor from within. His actions as Secretary of Labor and the actions of the Trump administration regarding the National Labor Relations Board should be carefully watched. Similar vigilance is recommended regarding political parties. With these two institutions, a thought pertains that resonates elsewhere as well. Most modern autocracies do not resort to explicit outlawing of parties and unions, but to their slow hollowing out and evisceration. Book burnings. I don't see book burnings in our near future. But anyone who has been reading the New York Times regular feature, The Week in Hate, is aware of numerous graffiti attacks and bomb threats against mosques and synagogues, and of anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim vitriol in social media. And here too, government at all levels has the ability to defund cultural projects and otherwise intimidate and curtail the full freedom of artistic and intellectual expression. The White House budget proposal seeks the elimination of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the NEH, and the NEA. And one more thought that I've added recently. The Nazi book burnings were not centrally ordered or organized. They were an example of what was called then working towards the Führer, a phenomenon where groups of people try to divine what would please their leader and then do it. This is what happened with the book burnings. Already during the campaign, Trump made statements that could be understood as incitement to violence. The increase in the incidence of hate crimes could be attributed to these statements. Trump's recent statements that journalists are enemies of the people is even more chilling. If we soon see reports of people burning copies of the New York Times and the Washington Post, I will take back what I said in the first sentence of this section. Establishment of a one-party state. It seems unlikely that the Trump administration could or would outlaw opposition parties by law or by decree. But in a modern autocracy, that is not necessary. If all branches of government are under the control of the same party, as is currently the case at the federal level and in many states, the opposition party can be rendered so powerless as to become irrelevant, making possible a semblance of a one-party state. Establishment of a secret police. While there is, as far as we know, no organ of the state remotely similar to Hitler's Gestapo, the internal and external security establishment in the United States is actually larger, more capable, and more powerful than anything the Nazis ever had. It is, yes, constrained by laws and by oversight and by the professionalism and the internalized constitutional values of its employees. But a situation is not unthinkable in which an executive could weaken those constraints and turn this powerful apparatus against the opposition. Purge of opponents or competitors in his own party. Of all the items that led to Hitler's absolute power, this is one that I almost didn't bother to list for comparison with our current situation. Almost nothing in our current situation is remotely analogous to the scenario that led to the Night of the Long Knives. of June 30 of 1934. To the extent that there is opposition to Trump within the Republican Party, it is less of a threat to him than the SA was to Hitler, and even if it were, it would be dealt with by methods other than brutal political murder. So, where does the comparison of these 16 items leave us? Generally speaking, when I initially went through this exercise for myself, I came away calmer than when I had started. I was encouraged that on most of these points of comparison, the differences were stronger than the similarities. That violently anti-democratic steps and measures seemed impossible or unlikely. That propaganda would not be able to completely replace free expression in civil discourse and the media. That the violent suppression of opposition individuals and parties and the establishment of a one-party state seemed unlikely. That the establishment of openly racist policies and institutions was unlikely. That the purging of the civil service in many professions and institutions might occur to some extent, but would be less complete than during the last years of the Weimar Republic. That the legislative was unlikely to pass an enabling law and vote itself out of existence, as did the Weimar Republic. Some of the reasons why the Nazis could push through and enact the steps and measures that led to dictatorship had to do with aspects of the historical situation in 1932, 33, and 34 that were very different from our situation now. The institutions of the young Weimar Republic were weak, and significant segments of the population had no interest in defending the new state and its constitution. On the contrary, the conservative and national segments of the population applauded the authoritarian measures Hitler implemented, shared his desire to abolish the parliamentary system and democracy, and approved of the march towards dictatorship. In contrast, the democratic institutions of the American Republic have persisted for more than 2 centuries. The adherence to constitutional principles and norms is deeply ingrained in most Americans. The judiciary, as illustrated by the ruling of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and other recent rulings against Trump's Muslim ban, is capable of asserting its role. Further, the United States has a rich tapestry of institutions and organizations of civil society that are designed to expose and resist abuses of government power. The marches of January 21st showed a widespread and intense level of resistance to Trump's plans. And yet, that the comparison of our current moment to the final death throes of the Weimar Republic is even plausible is very disturbing. That the current moment does not seem to suggest that we are at the beginning of a transition to an absolute dictatorship does not mean that we aren't in a transition to an autocratic regime in which the facade of democratic institutions still exists, but only in a hollowed-out, essentially irrelevant form. All of the Trump administration's policies and actions, from immigration to trade to healthcare and the environment, to name only a few, should be watched carefully. But the following areas, because they are areas in which the transition from democracy to autocracy would manifest itself most directly, should be watched with particular intensity. Anti-immigrant policies and actions. While the Trump administration's executive orders on immigrants have been stopped for now, they may eventually be implemented. Also, these are not the only vehicles of anti-immigrant policies and actions. The recent ICE raids and talk of beefing up the deportation force, one way or the other, are very troubling. What happens in this area in the next weeks and months must be watched very carefully. This is so because in this nation of immigrants, our immigrant neighbors should be treated fairly, justly, and with due process. But it's also important because whatever machinery of arrest, detention, and punishment is set up for and practiced against immigrants could in the future be used against other groups, regardless of citizenship status. Voting rights. Donald Trump's persistent false claims that millions voted illegally, causing him to lose the popular vote, will likely be used as a pretext to pass voter suppression laws, as the Republicans have already done in many states where they control the legislature and the executive. Doing so, often paired with gerrymandering, can make elections essentially irrelevant without needing to take the more radical step of abolishing them. The actions or inactions of Jeff Sessions' Justice Department will warrant special scrutiny. Freedom of the press. Donald Trump's first week in office saw an unprecedented assault on the press. Press Secretary Sean Spicer berated the White House press corps over their accurate coverage of inauguration crowds while insisting on falsehoods. Kellyanne Conway, counselor to the president, stated that Spicer had presented alternate facts. Steve Bannon, chief strategist and senior counselor to the president, told the press to, quote, shut up. The president himself called the New York Times and the Washington Post fake news. The continuous repetition of falsehood and lies is an old propaganda tool. Joseph Goebbels said, quote, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Unquote. The repeated claims that the best newspapers in the country publish fake news are designed to delegitimize the free press. No wonder that Orwell's 1984 briefly became the best-selling book on Amazon during the first weeks of Trump's presidency. Since I wrote these words, President Trump has labeled journalists enemies of the people. The trajectory is not good. Gubbing of public education. Since a well-functioning democracy requires well-educated citizens, it is important to pay attention to the new administration's education policy. The initial signs are not encouraging. In one of the more dystopian sections of his inaugural address, Donald Trump described the nation's schools in these terms, quote, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of knowledge, unquote. Ironically, these words seem to describe relatively well what Michigan's public school system looked like after Trump Education Secretary Betsy DeVos brought the state to implement many of her ideas about vouchers in charter schools. The Washington Post recently reported that, quote, public education advocates say that they fear that she will help propel America's public education system toward destruction, unquote. If that happened, it would indeed leave our young and beautiful students deprived of knowledge and thus susceptible to propaganda. So where does that leave us? How do we answer the question I posed? Does the late state of the Weimar Republic in Germany hold lessons for the current moment of the American Republic? Yes, it does hold lessons. First, and somewhat hopefully, we are not just a year or so away from full-fledged dictatorship, as Weimar Germany was when Hitler became Chancellor on January 30, 1933. But second, we may have begun to slide into some form of autocracy or fake democracy. Hopefully, this list of specific steps and actions undertaken by the Nazis in 32-33 will help us to be vigilant as we examine steps and actions taken by the Trump administration in 2016, 17, and beyond. What we can do to resist and reverse the slide towards autocracy can perhaps be part of our conversation after this lecture. To that end, I'd be glad to take some questions, and hopefully we can have some conversation. Thank you. Kathy, do you have the mic? Oh, there you are.
Yes? Questions? Anyone? And I'll walk around with the microphone so we can make sure everybody hears.
Professor Kruse, thank you very much. Would you please make a distinction or a comparison between propaganda and perspective?
Well, that's an interesting question. Did everyone hear it? I think perspective is a certain viewpoint on a given set of facts and reported reality. Propaganda is essentially the promulgation of lies in contradistinction to any facts. And now, I think the best propaganda starts with half facts and semi-facts, and then pushes them to complete lies. Because that way it can seem as if it is still grounded in some form of reality or in some form of plausibility. But generally speaking, I would say that perspective is, in a certain sense, a synonym for opinion. So a recitation of facts can be perspectival or opinionated, but that's very different from propaganda.
In terms of propaganda, I think it's good news that I've heard that the readership in some of our mainstream liberal newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post is hugely up, record numbers, which seems like a good sign to me. I just one more thing. I wondered if I've heard that the childhood and the relationship with their fathers between Trump and Hitler were very similar. Do you have any insight into that?
First, to your first point about the increased subscriptions, etc., of New York Times, Washington Post, and many other media outlets. Yes, I've read that too, and one of the ironic facts of our moment is that Donald Trump, who keeps promulgating about the failing New York Times, actually has been the best thing that has happened to the New York Times in the right and to other news outlets that are respectable. The question about the upbringing of Donald Trump and Hitler being very similar. I'm not sure. Well, first of all, one of the first links, so those of you who have gotten my sources and further reading document and can get more, those of you who haven't can get it from the library tomorrow. One of those first links is a very interesting article in Politico in the middle of 2016 where a sociologist or some other academic ran polls, and his findings were that actually the clearest predictor of a Trump voter was authoritarianism. It was not being poor and white, it was not being poor, white, and educated. The clearest predictor was authoritarianism. And there were certain questions that got at, were you raised in an authoritarian household, et cetera, et cetera. I know that Trump's father was a hard taskmaster who had great difficulty showing love, who when young Donald turned out to be a little bit of a hellraiser in school, shipped him off to a military boarding school. I'm not sure I can give sort of the point-by-point comparison that I did with this topic to your question. So I think there are probably similarities, but exactly how surprisingly detailed they would be, I cannot answer right now. Yes?
I heard on a PBS documentary of Trump.
Where's the mic?
We'll get to you next. Okay. I'll bring the mic back up. You with the mic, go ahead.
Thank you so much. A two-part question. In looking and analyzing the Weimar Republic and its collapse, and looking at our current situation, do you see also parallels in the lack of sustainability of the national debt? And in terms of how rapidly the collapse takes place or change takes place, did you examine that? And then, if so, which in your perspective, in your opinion, do you have more concern about in our republic? Would it be the rise of fascism or the rise of corporatism?
With respect to the national debt, and I alluded this in my sort of early thumbnail history of the Weimar Republic. By the time Hitler gets appointed Chancellor by Hindenburg in January of 1933, the economic situation of the Weimar Republic is actually on the upswing. It has begun to improve. Unemployment is down. One of the reasons why Hitler, in those two elections in 1932, from the earlier one to the November one, loses 5% almost, goes from 37% and something to 33% and something, is that many people who voted for him out of economic distress no longer do, because they see that things seem to be getting better. And more specifically with respect to the debt, there too the situation of the Weimar state was actually improving at the time, because the Allies, seeing what the world economic crisis was doing to Weimar Germany and fearing the political consequences, had begun to forgive some of the reparations that the German state had to pay after Versailles. So I think the situation with the national debt in Germany was improving and was not one of the direct root causes of Hitler. Well, we certainly have a lot of corporatism, and certainly a lot of corporations in Weimar Germany were behind Hitler, strong behind Hitler. As a matter of fact, in the earlier draft of my chronology, I had a paragraph about right after Hitler meets with the generals, he meets with industrial leaders, and he gets the same kind of enthusiastic support from them as he got from the generals. I think, you know, we've had corporatism. I mean, this is a capitalist country. It is a capitalist country with very big corporations. And we've had that for quite some time. Trump, I think, has added something new to it. This situation is different from what it used to be like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And also, you know, one of the reasons I try to be careful at the beginning to make a distinction between making comparison between two historical moments, and on the other hand making a comparison between two people, Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler, Donald Trump and the fascist, is that I'm not sure that even if the worst happens, that you would call what then exists straightforwardly fascism. You know, it could be autocracy, it could be a Putin-esque beast of a state. So I don't think, but you know, I don't mean to be coy. Obviously, there are troubling similarities, and there are troubling connections between some of the most powerful people, as I mentioned in Trump's lighthouse, to fascism, and to we know that you know, Steve, you know, if you want to sleep badly some night, read up on some of the things that Steve Bannon reads, and you know, Steve Bannon is a man who has spoken in aspirational ways about Satan, Darth Vader, and Lenin. He thinks they're great characters. He wants to dismantle the administrative state. So, you know, there are troubling associations that are unfortunately possible.
Yes. I saw a PBS documentary on Trump. This was before the election, and he was asked who in American history was an American leader who he most respected and admired. And after a long pause, Trump finally answered, "My father."
unfortunately have not seen that documentary yet, but, well, Trump, as many children of authoritarian fathers, and I'm not trying to commit psychiatry without license here, but have a sort of bipolar relationship to their fathers. On the one hand, they admire them greatly and are in awe of them, and on the other hand, they fear them and loathe them. And I mean, in the Trump biography, I read that Trump at his brother's funeral spoke for quite some time and not necessarily flatteringly about his father. But I'm sorry, I've lost track of your question.
There wasn't really a question.
Oh, okay. So I'm glad you said that, because then I can feel like I haven't. So anyway, I think he has, since he's become president, Donald Trump has made several gestures that he seems to be admiring Andrew Jackson greatly. He hung a picture of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office. He made a pilgrimage to the Andrew Jackson house, etc. Spoke very highly of him, which of course is a little troubling, because I think the point of comparison, Trump sees that they're both populists, but Andrew Jackson was also, as I understand it, quite someone who contributed greatly to the destruction of the Native Americans. So, it does not make me feel much better about Donald J. Trump that he seems to be admiring the person who's on our deathbed.
Are you?
I'm sorry.
Here. Are you encouraged by the failure of the propaganda that preceded the recent non-vote on the American health care? It seemed to me as if that was something of a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, I am encouraged by that, partly because, I spoke about the lack of constraint that a fully Republican legislature might exercise on Trump's executive power. It now turns out that in a weird way, actually, a unified Republican legislature, because they are not unified, actually sort of indirectly almost exercises constraint on his power, because they are so unable to govern and to compromise the Republicans that they cannot deliver for their president, apparently. So, yes, I mean, I find that news, I found that very encouraging and very good news for a change. It may be good news down the road, because there may actually be more resistance to Trump's agenda from the Republicans in a weird sort of back-asswards way than we had thought there would be. But on the other hand, there is also, if you read Trump biographies and so on, it emerges that often when he is, that Trump often, when he seems to be at his pinnacle, and I'm not talking about his career as a businessman, when his businesses were really well, he began to do some really stupid things, like buying an essentially bankrupt airline for too much money and wanting to put gold fixtures in the bathrooms and so on. And he almost went and then he went into the casino business, and he is one of the few businessmen that I know of who couldn't make money in the casino business. Although he did make money off his investors, because they lost their shirt. But so he had to declare bankruptcy as for his businesses. He very narrowly escaped personal bankruptcy, partly because he was apparently one of the first cases of too big to fail. He had some leverage over some of his banks because they just didn't want to, let him go bankrupt. And so that's an example of when he's really high up, he begins to do stupid things. But the other thing, when you read his biographies, seems to be true too. When he's really low, he begins to lash out and do some very effective things. So, I don't know, one of the things I think we've learned in the last, 2 years or so, is that it's probably a fool's game to try to predict what happens next with our current president. Right?
We'll take one more from this side and then I'll come over there, okay?
I thought this gentleman down here asked if there's a difference between fascism and corporatism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, either I dozed off, or did you answer that question?
I did ask that question, Pete, although I'm now for the first time it occurs to me that I may have answered it misunderstanding what you meant. By corporatism, did you mean the power of big economic corporations, or did you mean the kind of fascism that Mussolini's Italy was, which was actually a sort of corporatism in the sense that certain societal groups became power centers, like the peasants, the artisans, and so on. That can be called corporatism, but I think you meant the economic corporatism, right?
Or economic.
Yeah.
I think I was maybe poking a little fun at you for paying so much attention to the National Socialists and to the Third Reich, and maybe noting that we already have concentration camps, we have tremendous amounts of government malfeasance and corruption. We have the growth of a prison industrial complex, and we also are funding actively not only wars and war crimes against civilians around the world, but also systems of apartheid, like we see in occupied Palestine. We do this right now willingly with our taxpayer funds. So I guess I was wondering if we need to be alarmed about someone playing Hitler, or we need to be alarmed about what our government is already doing that we're not paying attention to.
Well, I certainly think we should be alarmed of some of the things you just recited that we are or not paying attention to. I think I would still argue that that situation would be very, very severely eclipsed if this country really became a fascist country. If you think that's bad, I would say you have seen nothing yet.
So I agree. I tend to think that Stalin was a much greater sinful evil in history, and I think that our country is already headed far down that path of corporatism and the quiet elimination of millions, and elimination of the rights of millions, in a way that most of society didn't ever do.
Well, there is certainly some of that, yes.
Can you talk about the role of populism in the Trump campaign and maybe compare that to the rise of Hitler and in terms of populism as propaganda?
Well, I think, one of the strange things about the word populism is that, if you start with the definition of it, that shouldn't be a bad thing, right? To have a movement that is for the populace as opposed to for the powerful. And there have been populisms in history that have been more like that. I think Donald Trump's populism is I'm actually not quite sure that it's a good term for him, because for one thing, it's quite employed. Here is a supposed populist who has stocked his administration with Goldman Sachs executives. So in a way, you need to be many of his supporters, I don't think see it that way. They think he is their voice, he speaks for them, he understands them.
It was a strategy.
So,
You lost your mic.
I think we have to take a mic check here. Because
Oh.
I think that's-
oh, it fell down. Did you hear me?
But I can hear you better now.
Thank you, Don. So anyway, I said that I'm not sure that populism really applies to Donald Trump, but also, you know, he does not have a. Hitler ran his government in a very inchoate way, intentionally, his dictatorship, in a way where there were many power centers that kept each other in check, and as long as they fought with each other, he felt that he had the power on the top. So in that sense, it was sort of inchoate, but in terms of ideology, it certainly was not. I mean, you know, read Mein Kampf. You know, there was a very clear ideology that was then implemented. Now, you know, with Trump, you never knew, to the extent that you could sort of stitch together an ideology from his pronouncements, and I'm not sure you really could, even if you wanted to try. That seems to be to some extent falling apart now, right? Partly because of the chaos in the Republican Congress, but also partly because I think he has for someone who wants to be a really ideological leader, you have to have an attention span. I'm not sure he does.
Would you say something about or compare the level of wealth inequality in the Weimar Republic to what we're experiencing today?
I cannot give you statistics on that. I'm sorry. Clearly, one of the major contributing factors to Hitler's rise was the impoverishment of the German middle class and lower middle class. That was the result of the Lost War, of the disastrous specifications of the Versailles Treaty, reparations and such, of one of the results of that economic pressure was in the early 20s, hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class and the lower middle class to a catastrophic degree. So in the sense that a lot of Trump voters seem to be people who used to be comfortable middle class and whose wages have not gone up in 20, 25 years or so. I think there are overlaps there. And maybe there's also an overlap in the sense that, as I said earlier, the economic situation in Weimar was actually beginning to get better when he came to power. But then the economic situation after the crash of 2008 in this country, at least for most people, was beginning to get better. Even for Trump voters, the wages were beginning to creep up and so on. But unfortunately, I cannot give you sort of exact inequality statistics.
You have a question?
Yes, thank you. I wonder if you've looked at any other historical analogies other than just the collapse of the Weimar Republic, because some historians have suggested that the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire through the collapse of the consulships is a better analogy for the present moment in the American evolution, because the economic collapse that preceded, as you point out, the rise to power of Hitler hasn't really happened yet. And in many ways, the economic situation in the U.S. isn't analogous to the Weimar Republic?
I read some months ago a column, but I think it was Paul Krugman who said that his bedside reading table recently had the books about the collapse of the Roman Republic, and that he saw some parallels there. So that confirms what you're saying. Well, I mean, one of the things that I realized as I worked on this, and look, I mean, the reason I landed at this comparison is partly, as I explained, personal. It's something that's on my mind when I see what's happening in this country. But if you want to look for other analogies and parallels of sliding into autocracy, and these would be cases on which I would not be an expert of any kind. The ones that would come to mind, I think, would be the slide of post-Yeltsin Russia into Putinism, autocracy. The slide of an almost relatively democratic Turkey into what is becoming more and more a dictatorship. And there too, you know, you could have parallels. Talking about Turkey, for instance. Okay, so there was a coup attempt against the elected government. That was bad, but Erdogan's reaction to that has been to use the occasion, just like Hitler used the Reichstag fire occasion to lock up hundreds of journalists, thousands and thousands of people, and trying to ram through a plebiscite right now that will make him president with all powers, abolish the position of prime minister. You know, I think partly what happens when you think about historical analogies, people come up with what they are rooted in. Like I, for instance, read that there's all kinds of discussion in Latin America about how much Trump is alike some Latin American caudillos and dictators. So people, from their perspective, you know, they have a lens and they say, oh, I've seen this movie before, right? So yes, I think there could be other historical analogies that might actually be more apropos than this one. I try to stress the differences as well as the similarities, but I think there might be a country out there and a historical moment out there that would actually be a more precise fit and therefore an even more instructive example.
We lost the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. Two people have been waiting patiently, and then I think we're going to have to end our discussion, but we might pick it up at a later date.
I very much appreciate your wide and deep reading. It seems very refreshing at the moment. What I'm particularly interested in right now is, from all that you have read, do you have any particular thoughts for us, those of us who live in this country? What might be the most important actions that we can take to help stop any slide toward autocracy?
I think in terms of my talk, the one indicator, the one signpost that I think probably should be the most prominent in our minds is if there is a terrorist event, a large 9/11 type event or a series of medium-sized events. I think that will be a moment of extreme peril, and at that point, anyone in this country needs to be very alert and very much, it needs to not succumb to fear and passivity, but resist if a Trump administration or Congress wants to ram through measures that are even more harsh than the Patriot Act was. So that's one thing I would say. The other, and I know the other is, this is sort of a subtext, I think, in everything I've said, that I find very concerning. I mean, Time magazine, apparently, I have not seen it yet, I have not read it yet, has a cover on their most recent thing. I think it says "The End of Truth," or, you know, post-truth universe. Timothy Snyder, a Yale historian historian of the Holocaust mostly, who has recently, and I do not own stock in this publisher. I do not know Timothy Snyder personally. We do not have a profit-sharing arrangement. But I would recommend to you, it's a very short, very small book on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. And the 20 lessons are, he formulates very practically. Okay, like for instance, the first one is, do not obey in advance. So I would recommend this book highly. Timothy Snyder, A, has the expertise to write this book. B, he had a brilliant idea, and he will, I hope, he will make publishing profits with this little book that are unthinkable to any academic. But I think he's doing us a real service, so I would recommend reading it.
I've read it, and I entirely agree with you.
Okay, great. I'm glad that. As far as, you know, I think there are probably other people in this audience who are more of the political activist bent than I am. But I would say, whatever you can do, whether it is marching or writing your congressman or showing up in their offices or town halls or to become an active citizen. And, you know, those are things that I think would be helpful. And again, as I mentioned I think several times, one of the reasons the Weimar Republic went down was that large segments of that population not only didn't really resist, they essentially applauded its destruction. So as long as there are, you know, sufficient numbers of people in this country who are willing to be active in their citizenship in whatever way is best for you, I think then that's a good thing.
Yeah. Also, thank you very much for the time and your knowledge. So right there, I want to. This question I had on my mind all the time is: you as an educator and teaching about German, what do you think? Everything starts with education. What could we do different and better here to educate about this time? When I go, for instance, in Seattle, in the university library, when I go to the German section, I'm German by the way, and I find 3 shelves filled with Hitler and Nazi and all this, and it's 100 years ago almost. And then it comes to a situation like this, and started in 2015. You know, as you said, you can't prevent history that history repeats itself, but a little more awareness about this, like we educate in Germany about this time, about Nazi and Weimar and things like you're prepared, you see this is a lie, this is propaganda, this can't be it, or this is not this category of education, but implying laws it's for me, it's a pretty risky business to run a country that large on 24 amendments. And and you see the Mr. Trump is, since October 2015, follow a lot of things he's doing wrong, but there is no conclusion, there is no repercussion. He's just doing and doing and doing. And there is still a lot of people there. Breitbart, Fox News is still the biggest TV company in this country as far as I know. So someone must watch this. So this is a deep question, but maybe something to take home and to think about. And maybe we start on a high school here and educate about this time. And the people are here are way past high school degree. That we should get kids involved, the future voters in this country, being alert about symptoms, all the symptoms, all what you did tonight. That would be, I think, a great idea to do this again in high school for the kids.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? What could we do differently?
Yeah. I mean, reflecting your 30-year fusion journey and the power journey.
Well, I think you in a way asked me about what is the status of history education and civics education in this country at this time, and I had read things about that are not very encouraging, that supposedly is no longer as good as it used to be. But I really, I don't have first-hand information about that. My wife and I have two sons who are now in their 30s. They went to high school in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and from all I could tell, they had a pretty good history and civics education. But it may have eroded since then, and also, of course, with the state of the public education system in this country, it depends on where you go to public schools, whether you have a average, excellent, or horrible education, right? So, but that's why I stress public education at the end of my talk. I do think that yes, I mean, you cannot have a functioning democracy without educated and critically thinking citizens. And that starts in high school at the latest, right? So I couldn't agree with you more that more needs to be done. And unfortunately, I mean, I think this moment did not start when Donald Trump came down his elevator in Trump Tower announcing his candidacy. It did not start with the beginning of the primary election season. I think this moment, specifically with reference to education, started when certain political and societal forces in this country began to chip away at education and the truth. For instance, when school boards, when citizens in certain school districts elected school board members who did not want their biology teacher to teach evolution. And when school board commissions in certain states began to elide, say, slavery or how Native Americans were treated. At that point, in other words, began to have an ideological as opposed to a truth-seeking agenda. And I think some of the susceptibility of some of our fellow citizens to real fake news, not what Donald Trump calls fake news, right? To conspiracy theories, to to believing things that are patently false just because someone they like says them and repeats them, as you have pointed out. I mean, I think that started, some decades ago, but it has gotten worse, I think, and our new media, social media, Facebook, to some extent Twitter, have, at least to some extent, exacerbated that situation, because now, I mean, the first time I became aware of this was when, as Kathy mentioned, one of my academic specialties are the works of Franz Kafka, and when I was doing these annotated editions of Kafka stories, partly to promote them, I signed up with Twitter, and I became aware that there were these Twitter accounts that basically were organized to spread certain Kafka quotes, and they did that, and most of the quotes were correct, but then there were also some that were complete howlers. There was Kafka never said anything anywhere, and I would start to foolishly actually tweet things back and say, no, it's not true, and don't repeat that. It was one of the most stupid things I ever did, because of course it did not diminish the incidence of these false quotes at all. And now in that arena, it was relatively harmless. I think people didn't do this for some malicious purpose. I think they did it because, and actually wrote something about this at one point, I think they did it because they wanted to believe that Kafka really said this, because it somehow spoke to them. And so if some Kafka scholar like me comes along and says, no, he never said that, no, they didn't want to accept that, right? And I think what's going on right now in our political realm is to some extent similar, comparable, because, if Donald Trump tweets something, at least some segment of the people who voted for him will therefore say that in the face of all facts, of all research, of all evidence, it must be true, right? And that, I think, is a very dangerous thing. I mean, I forget now, do you remember Timothy Snyder, is it in his book, or did I see him saying this recently in some interview? He has coined this phrase, post-truth is pre-fascist. Because if a society can no longer have a reasoned conversation and debate about what the truth is, then almost anything can be asserted and anything can become possible. And that's why I think this whole business about fake news, as we first understood it, namely as these websites and so on, where teenagers in Macedonia, make some money by posting things on Facebook, that was bad enough that the Trump administration now has turned that phrase around and calls real news fake news. That's not only a move with considerable chutzpah, but also can be very disruptive, I think. Okay.
If you didn't get a handout, we'll have them available at the library. I will also put the information on our website. And Jens has offered at some later date, if anybody, which I think a lot of people are interested in, having more of a discussion group with people like that. You see how the summer goes along? Okay. So we'll get that out there too for you. Thanks, everybody.